join here. He owns a pizza shop in New York City. He's undecided, but leaning towards Donald Trump. So what's your question for the senator?
Hi, I'm a lifelong Republican, and I've been married to my husband for 2 years now. And my question is, I've noticed a lot of religious freedom laws and somewhat institutionalized discrimination laws happening around the country. What would you as president do to protect me and my husband from that institutionalized discrimination?
Well, listen, when it comes to religious liberty is something that protects every one of us. It is the very first amendment, the very first phrase protected in the first amendment of the Bill of Rights. And religious liberty, it applies to Christians, it applies to Jews, it applies to Muslims, it applies to atheists. And all of us, we want to live in a world where we don't have the government dictating our beliefs, dictating how we live. We have a right to live according to our faith, according to our conscience. And that freedom ultimately protects each and every one of us. And we shouldn't have the right to force others to knuckle under and give up their faith and give up their belief. And for me, I mean, I have spent my entire adult life fighting to defend religious liberty, fighting to defend the freedom of every one of us to seek out and worship God. And I think keeping government out of the way of your lives protects the freedom of every one of us.
But when you talk about freedom, and what he's referred to with his husband, a lot of people would say, doesn't everybody have the freedom to be treated equally? Don't we all have the freedom to be equal?
Of course we do. And the First Amendment protects everyone equally. It protects our faith. It protects the faith of an Orthodox Jew to follow his or her faith without the government getting in the way and regulating kosher delis and restricting what can be served. It protects the freedom of all of us.
You know, you supported a constitutional amendment that would have the effect of overturning the Supreme Court decision on gay marriage. So what would that mean for couples like Todd and his husband who already are married?
Well, listen, I am a constitutionalist, and under the Constitution, marriage is a question for the states. That has been the case from the very beginning of this country, that it's been up to the states. And so if someone wants to change the marriage laws, I don't think it should be 5 unelected lawyers down in Washington dictating that. And even if you happen to agree with that particular decision, why would you want to hand over every important public policy issue to 5 unelected lawyers who aren't accountable to you, who don't work for you? Instead, if you want to change the marriage laws, convince your fellow citizens to change the laws. And by the way, it may end up that we've got 50 states, that the laws in one state may be different than another state, and we would expect that. We would expect the people of New York to adopt different laws, perhaps, than the people of California or Texas or Florida. And that's the great thing about a big, diverse country, is that we can have different laws that respect different values.
This is a very important issue, and another one is about gun violence, and Amy has a question.
That's right. Dimas Salivarios, an undecided Republican from the Bronx, and you are tall, but I will try to reach up here and get the microphone to you so you can ask the senator your question.
How you doing? I'm an ex-drug boss in New York City.
Wow.
A pastor now.
Fabulous.
In the housing projects in the Bronx. And wrote a book called Street God. And here's my question. In my community here in New York City, guns are coming in from the South into our African-American and Latino communities. And wanted to know, if you became president, what would you do to stop the gun pipeline from coming into my neighborhoods from the South?
Well, let me say, first of all, thank you for the ministry that you have, and thank you for your example, standing up and touching the lives of young men and young women in your community. Thank you for what you're doing. You know, the plague of gun violence we're seeing is horrific, and I believe we need to use every tool possible to go after the criminals. In the wake of the Newtown shooting, the horrible shooting at that elementary school, which horrified all of us, I joined with Senator Chuck Grassley in drafting legislation that became known as the Law Enforcement Alternative. And what it did is it targeted bad guys. It targeted felons. It targeted fugitives. Felons and fugitives, for example, who try to illegally buy firearms. And there are tens of thousands of them every year that are caught illegally buying firearms. Right now, the Justice Department isn't prosecuting them.
I'm talking about gun dealers in the South that are not drug dealers, but are buying these guns and shipping them into my community. Can you deal with that? The urban community, not that area you just mentioned.
Well, but the way to solve gun violence, I believe, is targeting the criminals, not targeting law-abiding citizens. If you look at the jurisdictions with the worst murder rates, most of them are the ones with the very strictest gun control laws. Because when you put gun control laws in place, the criminals don't hand over their guns, but the law-abiding citizens do, and it ends up leaving them more vulnerable. And so you look at Washington, D.C., you look at Chicago, both of them have for years effectively banned firearms, and both of them have for years been right at the top of murder rates. I don't think the answer is stripping people's rights to defend themselves. Listen, if you're a single mom living in a tough neighborhood, the Second Amendment protects your right that if someone comes through the window trying to harm your kids, you have a right to protect your kids. You have a right to be armed and protect your family. And I believe the way to stop the gun violence is not disarming the law-abiding citizens, but rather targeting the criminals and coming down on them like a ton of bricks. And the point I was making, I drafted legislation that would go after the criminals, that would prosecute any felon or fugitive who tries to illegally buy a gun. And the Democrats filibustered it. Harry Reid led the filibuster because their view was if they couldn't strip away the Second Amendment rights of everybody here, they weren't willing to go along with targeting criminals. It doesn't work when you strip the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. I want to target the bad guys and not the good guys.
Senator, we got a lot more questions coming up. I'm going to take a quick break for the weather. Let's go to Rob outside.